I think this will make a great box. Great chest. All around. Great. Great chest. Look how strong it is. Look how sturdy it is. This is how great of a woodworker my dad was. He was excellent. I mean, look at this thing. I can stand on it. Ooh. Whoop. Yeah. Woo. Look at me. Hands on the ceiling.
This box was a toolbox that my dad kept in his pickup truck and kept various tools in as he went from job to job. Since taking this out of his truck, this has been sitting on a workbench in the shop for quite some time, and I've had this project on my head also for a very long time. What I want to do is take this toolbox that my dad used for his tools and make it into a blanket chest, adding a lid, molding, and some feet. It's not a complicated project, but it's one, like I said, I've wanted to do for quite a long time.
Okay, so all these pieces are the molding for the chest.
Next step is to take everything, cut it into decent lengths, or at least the long piece anyway, and then put everything on the table saw so that way we can get everything to be the same width. Well, I made my first whoopsie of the project. You see, this piece was supposed to go back like this, and this piece was supposed to overlap like that. But I cut this piece too short, so now in order to line up with the other end, it has to be flush with the front, and this has to be back over this. Whereas the opposite side, this overlaps this piece. But I was able to accommodate it since I hadn't cut this piece yet, so I accommodated it with this piece. You see, that's the thing about making though. You have to be willing to say oops. You have to be willing to make mistakes.
After making that mistake, I went ahead and finished all of the trim for the top piece, cutting everything so that it all fit on the chest.
So I didn't measure these out because I'm trying to conform the pieces to the box, not measurements. So why would I measure if I'm trying to make the pieces match the dimensions of the box? Anyway, I've got the bottom and the top pieces to size, and so now that I've done that, I'm going to sand this and then get these ready to put on and then glue them on and probably brad nail them.
It's important to note here that there was a ring, for lack of a better term, that came with the toolbox. I didn't find it like sitting in the truck, but I found it somewhere in the shop. It's a 2-inch tall piece that's made for the lid, and so I cut the molding that I'd cut out so that way it would be the same width as all the other pieces, but the piece would be spread over the chest itself and the lid. And so that's what I'm getting ready to glue up right now, is that part of the molding that sits on the lid.
Okay, so next step is to actually start gluing some things up. So this is the top of the chest. I've cut the molding down to size for the top. Have some inconsistencies due to sanding, but not a problem. See, all I did was just take the molding I had cut out and cut it. In order to do this, I'm going to use glue, and I'm going to do something that I never do. I'm going to pull out my automatic nailer. I just don't use it because the staples are expensive, so I don't want to become reliant on it. That and the thing always seizes up every time I try to use it. I always put a million drops of oil in there before I use it, but it always seizes up. Damn thing. Now, if you would excuse me, I need to turn the air compressor on. Took about 10 minutes, but we are all squared away. Yeah, yay rectangles.
After that, I went ahead and glued and bradded on all of the molding for the top of the chest, not the lid part, but the top of the chest itself. And then the next thing of note was that I cut out my little feet for the bottom molding of the chest. And the reason I do these little feet as opposed to just leaving the bottom flat is because it's so much easier to adjust these 4 little feet in the corners when I'm trying to get the chest to sit flat on the ground, as opposed to trying to get this huge long piece, which who knows how many things could go wrong, to sit flat on the ground. Then there are the people that say, well, why don't you just go to the store and buy those little rubber feet that you can nail onto the bottom of your chest? I mean, yeah, you could do that, but I mean, I don't want to spend money on my projects if I don't have to. And plus, I like the way this looks anyway, as opposed to just having a flat piece at the bottom. To cut out my little feet, I marked a straight line across the bottom of how tall I wanted them to be, and then I found something round with a radius that I liked and marked out the little curved part that I wanted, and then I took it over to the bandsaw, cut it as straight as I could, and then cleaned it up with the table saw, took it over to the drum sander, and sanded it smooth, and called it a day. Since these are holding weight, I am gluing these as well. I'm also brad nailing them to hold them in place while the glue dries. And in order to line these up, I'm just aligning it so that way the bottom of it just sits barely above the bottom rim of the toolbox or chest. My dad was incredibly good at making things square, level, and straight, and so lining it up as close as I can with the bottom of this chest is really all I need to do to make sure it's going to sit flat. Next, I cut all the vertical pieces to size, and because I wasn't consistent in terms of the distance between the bottom and top molding all the way around, it was somewhat of a fitting process, and I found that I was about 1/8 of an inch off from my lowest corner to my highest corner. And then before I went ahead and nailed them on, I sanded the inside edge because I knew I was going to have a difficult time after it was in place to do that. But there were some edges that I forgot, and it really ticked me off that I had to go back and sand it by hand with a little piece of sandpaper. But, you know, mistakes happen. Move on. And then these pieces are just for decoration. They're not holding any weight, or they're not going to pry off somehow. So brad nailing them is more than plenty to hold these in place. No glue. So I know it's very common for people to use piano hinges on projects like this. I do not want to spend $20 on a hinge for one project. So instead, I'm going to use these door hinges I got from a job that I did last summer where I had to replace a bunch of doors in someone's condo, and I kept all of the door hinges from the job. And these door hinges are actually going to overlap, so instead of just using a router and routing out the mortises for the hinges, it was literally so much easier to just mount this thing on my crosscut sled on a table saw and just go back and forth with the table saw and cut out the mortises that way. And I lined up the chest with the back for the first two cuts, like on either edge, and then I pushed it up to the front of my crosscut sled so that way I could see my progress. I'm also too lazy to set up a dado stack. So yeah, I went over it a bunch of times, cut it out, and then took it over to the workbench, and then I just filed it down a little bit to clean it up. And I set the hinge in there, and the hinge fit great. Similar to the rest of the chest, my dad had already done a glue up for the lid from this chest, so all I had to do was really cut it down to size, which really wasn't that dramatic, and then I also added a round over to it at the router table, and then I just took a hella bunch of pocket hole screws and screwed the top ring to the lid. Not very interesting, but it was a hell of a lot of pocket hole screws. After all of that hard work, I put the hinges on the chest and the lid and did a final test fit, and everything looked great. I was finally ready for the last set of steps on this project. I was ready for finishing. And sanding itself is its own hobby, so I don't try to go over the top, but I do want to make this chest look as great as possible. So usually what I do is that I sand the thing smooth first, and then I go back, and then I go through and fill all the holes with wood filler. And that's what I did this time, and it took me a long time and a lot of wood filler. And I thought I had like nothing left in this tube, then I cut it open and used the rest of it on about half the chest, and I scraped every little stinking bit out of this little tube of wood filler. Here, look at it. Yeah, there was like none left. A coat of primer, 2 coats of trash paint, and hardware later, and this is how this baby came out. I need to add a chain so I can keep the lid open, but otherwise this baby's done. I also went ahead and made a tray for the inside, which I'll feature in another video. I am really happy with how this project came out. My dad and I, in all the years we spent together, all the time we spent building the shop, we never built one project together except for this one. He built the box, I put the trim on it, finished the lid, and painted it. This gave me a special opportunity I never had before, and although I didn't get to do it with him, to be able to finish something that he started gives me an incredible feeling that nothing else could. This also gives me the opportunity to have a place to collect all the things I want to keep to remember my dad. And that's really why I wanted to build this chest. So I'm super excited that it's done now. I'm happy I can finally put some stuff in here and have a lasting memory of my dad in my possession. So for all of you that watched the whole way through, thanks again for following this build, and thank you for understanding what a special project this was for me. This is probably one of my favorite projects I've ever done. Thanks, and I'll catch you guys in the next build.